Let's look at a hypothetical situation. Let's say you're a musical theater student and your high school announces it will be producing a piece by Gilbert and Sullivan. Before I give you any other information, which one is it? I'll admit that there's an outside chance that it could be HMS Pinafore if your school's musical theater program is run by the choir director, or possibly the Mikado if your school's musical theater program is run by a racist, but in all likelihood, if your musical theater program is producing only one Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, it's most likely the Pirates of Penzance. Even if you've never seen the Pirates of Penzance before, you probably know one or two things about it. First and foremost, that it has pirates in it, which are always fun. It's also a script with a lot of physical comedy, and one that doesn't take itself too seriously. And if you only know one song from the entire Gilbert and Sullivan canon, there's a good chance it's this one.
I am the very model of a modern major general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England and I quote the Fighters article from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical.
Likely the most well-known patter song ever written, the Major General's song is famous for the rapidity and intelligence of its lyrics, the sprightly pace of the underlying score, and of course the fact that everyone has parodied it. And I mean everyone.
I am the very model of a modern major general. I've information, vegetable, animal, and mineral.
Manganese and mercury, molybdenum, magnesium, dysprosium, and scandium, and cerium, and cesium.
Why anyone who wants a job with study lists a mystery.
Then smack the villain with a fish, I know my cartoon etiquette.
Though sometimes my adventures seem absurdly operatical. Operatical? Tactical? Tactical? Aha!
But we should back up a bit. Back to the part where I asked you to predict which Gilbert and Sullivan operetta your hypothetical school would be producing. Why did you gravitate towards the Pirates of Penzance? Because here's the thing, Gilbert and Sullivan wrote a lot of operettas, 13 of them in fact. And there are entire companies of so-called Savoyards who make it their mission to keep the Gilbert and Sullivan repertoire alive, nearly 150 years after their first collaboration. Opera aficionados will testify to the continued power and relevance of Sullivan's music, and Gilbert's lyrics have been compared to everyone from Noel Coward to Mark Twain to Lin-Manuel Miranda. So, with that said, why do musical theater companies only feel comfortable producing one of their works? And what exactly about Pirates changed since it premiered in 1879? Because the high-energy, loud-belting, physically exhausting version of the musical as we know it today, well, that's basically the opposite of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta. You might predict that it was a slow evolution over the course of more than a century, of the old Savoyard ways slowly decaying as new musical conventions took over and revitalized the classic. Or it was one production in 1980. A production with the bravery to completely toss the old rulebook out. A production that blew the doors off a century-old libretto and changed everything. So, if you want to know about how an operetta that sounded like this turned into a musical that sounds like this, then let's talk about how Gilbert and Sullivan's The Pirates of Penzance went from operetta to musical theater. The year is 1878. Librettist William Schwenk Gilbert and composer Arthur Sullivan are working on a new operetta entitled HMS Pinafore, a satire of the British class system and the way that it promotes unqualified people to positions of power. This will be their fourth collaboration and their second under the newly formed Comedy Opera Company, a collaboration with London theatre impresario Richard Doyley Carte and a handful of additional board members. Richard Doyley Carte, who I'm just going to call Carte for the rest of this video, had been the producer for Gilbert and Sullivan's early work Trial by Jury, and he had quickly realized that Gilbert and Sullivan fit perfectly into his artistic mission, which was to promote family-friendly, recognizably British operetta, to compete with the more ribald burlesque and the more French opéra bouffe. Carte organized the Comedy Opera Company to control licensing on future Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, as well as secure venues so the pair wouldn't have to shop their work around to other impresarios. They'd founded the group the previous year, with an operetta called The Sorcerer that was a modest success. But Pinafore?
Oh, the joy of that jar unforeseen, the cloudy sky is now serene, the God of the overflow has hung his ensign high above, the sky is overlaid.
HMS Pinafore took off like wildfire, becoming the pair's first international hit. Such was the success that it caused a schism between the directors of the comedy opera company. Looking to regain control, Cart moved to renegotiate a new deal with Gilbert and Sullivan for a new company where the three of them would get an even three-way split of the profits, without any other board members. This became the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, which assumed sole legal authority to produce Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. Legal authority, that is, in England. Across the Atlantic, it was another story. American copyright law at the time had no provisions for international artists, so Gilbert and Sullivan had no recourse against the unauthorized productions of Pinafore that began to pop up around the States. The D'Oyly Carte did stage an official production of Pinafore in New York to secure the American copyright and better fight off amateur productions, but they still proliferated beyond what Carte could control. The issue also led them to be very cautious when planning their next production. In order to prevent any piracy from American producers, Carte devised a workaround. When the pair's newest operetta premiered in 1879, they would first hold a reduced copyright performance in London on December 29th to secure the British copyright before formally premiering the show in New York to secure the American copyright on December 31st. That show, the only Gilbert and Sullivan operetta to technically premiere in America, was The Pirates of Penzance. The Pirates of Penzance, or The Slave of Duty, which is the full title, most of the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas have a double title, fits squarely into the mold of Gilbert and Sullivan's other collaborations, a comic satire of the English social order in which a ludicrous scenario is resolved in the most logical manner possible. Frederick, a sailor, is apprenticed to a group of pirates by mistake, but he's so gosh darn dutiful that he goes along with it until he turns 21. After he leaves the pirate band and falls in love with Mabel, the first young woman he's ever seen, a series of hijinks ensue involving a vow not to harm any orphans, a contract loophole about being born on February 29th,
That though you've lived 21 years, yet if we go by birthdays, you're only 5 and a little bit over.
a very ill-equipped police squadron, and one modern major general.
Their father is a major general.
Yes, yes, he is a major general.
Yes, yes, I am a major general.
The libretto contains many clever subversions that audiences today may not catch. The pirates open the show not by drinking grog or rum, but sherry, a drink almost exclusively associated with the aristocracy. The Major General's song also ends with him stating that his military knowledge is the one thing he is lacking in, which is arguably the most important thing for the model of a modern Major General to know.
For my military knowledge, I'm plucky and adventurous. Has even been found out at the beginning of the century. But still in matter, vegetable, animal, and mineral, I am the very model of a modern Major General.
Which is perhaps Gilbert's point that the modern Major General is more obsessed with the periphery than he is with actual warfare. Even the title is a joke. Penzance is a beach resort at the southwest corner of England, a place that would never be overrun with pirates. The equivalent title today would be The Pirates of Ocean City, or The Pirates of Myrtle Beach. All this to say that even in its day, Pirates of Penzance was not an operetta that took itself seriously. None of the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas did, except Yeoman of the Guard, the only one with a moderately serious ending. But it was still, without question, an operetta. The first musical wouldn't come around for nearly 50 years, Showboat in 1927. I mean, just listen to the vocal style comparing a classic production to a more recent one. Response was positive, including an immediate violation of the American copyright by companies on a scale that Gilbert and Sullivan basically gave up on enforcing. The production ran 100 performances in New York and 363 performances in London. Pirates was added to the rotating rep of the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company in 1893, and remained in the rep until the company went defunct. Although both Gilbert and Sullivan were pleased with Pirates, both in terms of audience response and in satisfaction with their own work, the piece was never considered to be among their most successful works during their lifetimes. Certainly, it was in the upper half of their output, but it was overshadowed by the enormous success of Pinafore just before, and Patience just after. Eventually, they'd all be surpassed by The Mikado, which was a huge success despite being a racist pile of garbage. Not that I'm editorializing. After Gilbert and Sullivan's final collaboration in 1896, their works were kept in rotation by the D'Oyly Carte, which also dealt with licensing the operettas, at least until Gilbert's lyrics entered the public domain in 1961. After that point, the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company hobbled along for a few years until their finances dried up, and they shuttered in 1982. However, they did produce high-quality recordings of all 13 operettas, and can be almost single-handedly credited with keeping Gilbert and Sullivan in the Western canon. Even before the pieces entered the public domain, though, the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas were licensed by companies of all sizes. According to the National Operatic and Dramatic Association, or NODA, by 1914, more than 200 productions of Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas were occurring annually worldwide. By 1948, Life magazine was able to announce that there had been more productions of Gilbert and Sullivan's works in America than there had been of Shakespeare's plays that year. And yet, by the middle of the century, the performing arts were welcoming a new genre, one that was wholly American and wholly in competition with operetta.
All I want is a room somewhere far away from the cold night air, with one enormous chair. Now, wouldn't it be lovely?
As operetta began to morph into musical theater, and was eventually superseded in popularity by the mid-century golden age of Broadway, amateur companies began to fold these newer, more modern productions into their programming. Amateur companies that lacked a distinct mission to preserve the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta tradition began to stop producing this more operatic style in favor of the more in vogue musical theater productions. There were exceptions, particularly of HMS Pinafore and The Mikado, but these were still presented in a style quite similar to the D'Oyly Carte premieres. This is partially a stylistic difference not of the writing, but of the licensing. A musical theater script typically consisted of a dialogue book and a musical score, which contained some stage directions, but these were typically taken as suggestions from the original production. In contrast, when licensing the operettas, the D'Oyly Carte would often provide not just a libretto and score, but pages of stage directions and design notes, dictating how to produce the show in a way that matched the D'Oyly Carte premiere as much as possible. To quote from music critic Harold C. Schoenberg, "Tradition in grand opera is nothing against tradition in Gilbert and Sullivan, which has been handed down through the generations. We expect their tradition to be observed. Every tempo, every nuance, every inflection, every moment on stage has been committed to memory, and woe be unto him who departs from the holy text." He later added, "Gilbert and Sullivan productions should be frozen in history. We like it that way. It has to be that way." By the late 20th century, a division had arisen between the musical theater companies and the Savoyards, the companies founded on the mission of producing all of Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas in the manner dictated by the D'Oyly Carte managers. And this slowly began to lead to dwindling audience desire to see the operettas. As the Savoyards retreated into performance tradition, audiences, on the whole, were moving on to the theatrical innovations of the late 20th century. For a rough estimate of their declining popularity among the general public, Broadway theaters hosted 28 productions by Gilbert and Sullivan between 1946 to 1960, but have only staged 5 since they entered the public domain in 1961, the most recent being 1987's Mikado. So that's where we're at by 1980. The Pirates of Penzance is frozen in history alongside the other Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. So how does it become unfrozen and break out into the world of musical theater and greater popularity? Well, it's a long story, but as always, it begins with someone cutting funding for the arts. By 1980, Ed Koch was the mayor of New York and was making cuts to the city budget. One of the most drastic cuts was a dramatic reduction of the Office of Cultural Affairs, which included cutting the entire budget of the New York Shakespeare Festival. This stirred up the ire of one of New York's most famous theatrical producers, Joseph Papp. Papp was the founder of the Public Theater, a legendary off-Broadway venue dedicated to works by up-and-coming artists. At that point, the most well-known productions from the public were For Colored Girls, Hair, and A Chorus Line. Their most well-known recent production is that one about the Founding Father.
Now I'm the model of a modern major general, the venerated Virginian veteran, whose men are all lining up.
The Public Theater also runs New York's Shakespeare in the Park, which stages free productions of Shakespeare's plays in the outdoor Delacorte Theater every summer. The reasoning given for the funding cut was that the public's most recent hit, A Chorus Line, was still doing excellent business on Broadway, thus keeping the funding at the public solid enough that Mayor Koch determined that the Public Theater no longer needed city assistance to produce Shakespeare in the Park. Joe Papp, however, took this personally. He'd gone toe-to-toe with 5 of the last 5 mayors of New York to fight for the importance of Shakespeare in the Park, and expected that the city would support it. Although another arts organization, Summer Arts Fund, offered to donate the budget needed, Papp turned it down. For him, it wasn't about the money. It was about considering Shakespeare in the Park to be a vital public service, which deserved to be on the city's budget. In response, Papp canceled plans to produce A Midsummer Night's Dream in the summer of 1980, and vowed that there would be no Shakespeare play produced that year. Still, even if there would be no Shakespeare in the Park, Papp could stick it to the city by producing something else. On a car ride with director Wilfrid Leach, who had directed the previous season's productions of Coriolanus and Othello, Papp suddenly remembered performing in The Mikado in school. He suddenly turned to Leach and announced that Leach would be directing The Mikado that summer, and told him to go find the record and listen to it. Leach couldn't find The Mikado, but he was able to find The Pirates of Penzance. Leach thought the album art for Pirates was less boring than the other Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, so that was the one he bought. It's unknown which version of Pirates Leach was listening to with the good cover art, but judging by what was available at the time, it was either the 1961 or 1968 D'Oyly Carte releases, both with cover art that's great in its own right. After listening to only the second half of the second act, Leach called composer Bill Elliott and informed him that Pirates of Penzance would be performing at the Delacorte that summer. However, Leach was uninterested in producing Pirates by the D'Oyly Carte rulebook. After all, Pirates had been in the public domain for nearly 20 years, so it would be entirely possible to produce their own version of the show without contacting the company at all. To quote Leach, "The problem with classics is that they're classics. Everybody has an attitude and an image they want fulfilled. Clive Barnes has read 12 prefaces and he wants it to be like his favorite preface. I'm interested in it before it was a classic, thinking about how people experienced it when it was a new play." The idea of a director having a vision that diverged from the original practice was a dividing issue by 1980. It had only been 10 years prior that director Peter Brook had rejected original practice at the Royal Shakespeare Company with his radically reimagined Midsummer. It was also a particular sticking point in opera, where the conductor typically controlled the production. Following a controversial staging of Wagner's Ring Cycle in 1976, where director Patrice Chéreau basically ignored all traditions about what the staging should look like, the audience had rioted. The concept of Regie Theatre, or a director's theatre, was controversial. Leach's view was that if Pirates was the pop music of 1879 when it premiered, then his production would sound like the pop music of 1980. That informed the new orchestrations, which mixed synth into a reduced orchestral score, as well as the casting, which found pop rock singers to play the lovers, Mabel and Frederick. Mabel would be played by Linda Ronstadt, who was at the time one of the most successful figures in the 70s rock scene. As luck would have it, Ronstadt had met with Joe Papp once before, during which she had indicated her interest to perform in, quote, a theater with a curtain. The Delacorte would, ironically, have no curtain, but still, Ronstadt indicated her interest and Papp cast her immediately, without an audition. As for Frederick, they wanted a teen idol for the role. By chance, Leach saw Rex Smith on the cover of a magazine, got in contact, and Smith was in New York the following day. Smith had been on Broadway before as one of the replacements for Danny Zuko in Grease, but he was still better known as a pop singer. During their meeting, Leach mentioned that Frederick was essentially Errol Flynn, whereupon Smith pulled a photo of Flynn out of his wallet and announced his intention to, quote, swash until I buckle. He booked it.
My eyes are fully open to my awful situation. I shall go once to Mabel and will make a renovation. I will tell her I am Baba.
The other leads were veteran stage actors. George Rose, a longtime collaborator with the public as the Major General, Patricia Routledge as Frederick's maid, Ruth, Tony Azito as the Chief of Police, and relative newcomer Kevin Kline as the Pirate King.
Oh, better far to live and die under the brave black flag I fly than play a sanctimonious part with a pirate head and a pirate heart.
The staging at the outdoor Delacorte Theatre also brought the action closer to the audience than any production at the stuffier Savoy Theatre. Pirates and Daughters ran through the audience, with Kline at one point inventing a bit of physical comedy where he fought the conductor sword to baton. Although Joe Papp was nervous all through rehearsals, audience response was almost universally positive. Schoenberg, writing about the 1980 Delacorte production, observed, "The nice thing about the Shakespeare Festival performance was its tongue-in-cheek but really affectionate look at the lovely relic. There was, thank goodness, virtually no condescension. This may not have been the Pirates of Penzance as done by the D'Oyly Carte group in its best days, but there is no longer such a thing as best days. Traditionalists could live with this Pirates, even if it was not frozen history. The production was so successful that it transferred to Broadway in January 1981. It received 7 Tony Award nominations, winning for Best Revival, Klein for Best Actor, and Leach for Best Director.
And this extraordinary company that took a 100-year-old classic and turned it into the very model of a modern major musical. Thank you very much.
Its 23-month run still stands as the record for the longest run of a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in New York. Theater critic Frank Rich wrote, "This show's totally assured tone, funny yet not campy, sweet yet not soupy, is what brings its diverse elements together. By rethinking, but not rewriting, Gilbert and Sullivan's work in the highly charged terms of modern musical comedy, Mr. Papp and Company have regained the best of both worlds. Indeed, they have united civilized British wit and American showbiz know-how in a combustive Broadway musical." The production, affectionately known as Papp's Pirates, was professionally shot and televised, and can be found today on YouTube. That's the source of the clips that you're seeing now. Leach's interpretation was also formally adapted into a film in 1983, with the original cast except for Patricia Routledge, who was replaced by Angela Lansbury as Ruth.
Though I'm a nurse, you might do worse than make your boy a pilot.
It's pretty close to the original, with a little more improvisation and more visual gags.
Sighing well a day.
There was also another unrelated adaptation called The Pirate Movie, released in 1982. It was a flaccid and shameless attempt to ride the pirate bandwagon a year before the real film came out. It is bad and looks like it was made on a budget of $4.
And it is a glorious thing to be the Pirate King. I am the pirate!
Before moving on, I'd like to return to Frank Rich's review of the Broadway production for one prescient note. As of today, New York's affection for the Pirates of Penzance is unlikely to remain merely a summertime crush. This is the beginning of a full-blown love affair that just may last for years. It is hard to overstate the impact of this single production on the way that the Pirates of Penzance is viewed and performed today. To build just a short list of common staging choices for modern-day productions of pirates that premiered in the Leach production: a pirate king that looks more like Jack Sparrow than Blackbeard, the addition of the Matter-Patter from Ruddigore or Sorry Her Lot from HMS Pinafore, the key change and chorus repeat at the end of With Cat-Like Tread, the similar repeated faster chorus of Modern Major General,
In fact, when I know what is meant by mammal, only reveling, when I can tell the sight of another rifle from a javelin,
the Major General holding a parasol and wearing a pith helmet, any version that uses the bursting through the background poster art, the entire idea that the show can be adjusted and embellished with improvisation and audience interaction, and, of course, the view that the show is dance-heavy or physically difficult for actors. That last one is almost exclusively Kevin Kline's fault. The changes were such that there are now 2 different versions of Pirates of Penzance to license. Music Theatre International allows companies to license the public theater edition of the show, while a more traditional orchestration is held by the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization through Concord Theatricals. The success of Papp's Pirates led to an almost immediate surge in stagings of the work by other companies. The public theater production transferred to the West End in 1982, with Tim Curry as the Pirate King.
And live and die a pirate king.
The adjustments to performance style were further codified by a famous 1984 production of the musical in Australia, which was remounted and filmed in 1994. Comparatively, it went much further with improvisation and mockery of the source material than the Delacorte production did.
Let's go!
It wasn't me, it was one of the musicians.
Let's compare the choreography for With Cat-Like Tread. The nice thing about the Shakespeare Festival performance was its tongue-in-cheek but really affectionate look at the lovely relic. There was, thank goodness, virtually no condescension. It is admittedly difficult to find an empirical measure for the rise in popularity of pirates among musical theater companies nationally, so I will discuss 3 prominent examples. Seattle's Fifth Avenue Theater, New Jersey's Paper Mill Playhouse, and St. Louis' The Muni are all companies that specialize in producing exclusively musicals. Each of them has only produced one Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in the last 60 years. For all 3 companies, it was The Pirates of Penzance, or Pirates, the abridged version with a new book by Nell Benjamin from 2006. In the case of the Muni and the Fifth Ave, both of them produced Pirates within 3 years of the Public Theater's production, and have both since produced it again. Papp's Pirates also boosted the show's reputation among opera companies, who stuck closer to original practice. The New York City Opera, Chicago's Lyric Opera, and Opera Australia all produced Pirates in the 21st century, after having never produced any Gilbert and Sullivan before, or having produced only the Mikado decades prior. I could keep finding examples of Pirates of Penzance being produced in the modern day, but honestly, tracking the production history of a public domain work is nearly impossible. So, if you will, I'll return to the question from the beginning of this video. If your musical theater company is producing one Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, which one is it? That's how popular Pirates of Penzance is. So to answer the question, why do musical theater companies feel comfortable producing the Pirates of Penzance? Answer: there was this one really high-profile production that wasn't by an opera company or a Savoyard group, but an experimental off-Broadway theater that decided to rewrite the rules around how to produce a classic, took great pains to make the story and music accessible and enjoyable to modern audiences, and, in general, fundamentally alter the definition of what Pirates was. On the whole, the public still sees the Mikado and Pinafore as operettas, but Pirates is a swashbuckling musical. More than anything else, the public theater production of Pirates made people want to produce it again because it made the script feel immediate. By updating the style, they managed to capture something like the way it must have felt like to watch a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in 1879 for an audience 101 years later. Compare this to the recent Broadway revivals of Oklahoma and West Side Story, both of which update a classic musical to shake off the accumulated assumptions about the right way to produce a script, in an attempt to make the production feel as radical as the original productions did. But to this question is a companion question, one that doesn't often get asked. Why is Pirates of Penzance the only Gilbert and Sullivan operetta that musical theater companies feel comfortable producing? Can this method of revitalization work for the other 12 operas in the canon? There have been a handful of high-profile productions of the other operettas by non-opera and non-Savoyard companies, although the main 3 tend to be Pirates, Pinafore, and Mikado. The most well-known reinvention of Gilbert and Sullivan in the 21st century may be the experimental Chicago theater troupe The Hypocrites. They produced Pirates in 2010, directed by Sean Graney, in a modern beach aesthetic. This was remounted in 2012 in repertory with The Mikado, staged in the same style, which was followed by HMS Pinafore in 2014. Each of these productions also toured around the country briefly. But this avoids the central question. Earlier I said that this production rewrote the rules, but what specifically changed? Papp's Pirates was a unique case, a perfect combination of artists with the right material, the alchemy of which is likely not replicable in the same way. That said, the only major structural alteration was the orchestrations. To quote from the Schoenberg article again, "With all its tomfoolery on stage, the Papp production did take Pirates seriously. Not one line was cut, not one piece of music omitted. It was a brilliant resolution that translated the idea of the original into a modern conception without vulgarity or strain." The major changes were simply in performance style and the willingness of the actors to run with Leach's new take on a classic text. What Papp's Pirates really changed was the perception around how the show was supposed to be produced. Compare again to Peter Brook's Midsummer, or Trevor Nunn's minimalist Macbeth, which was staged at the RSC 1 year prior to Pirates. These productions of Shakespeare were structurally identical in text to the more original practice-inspired staging that had come earlier, but they were part of a wave of productions that helped audiences acclimate to seeing Shakespeare in a regitheater style. Nowadays, it's almost a novelty to see Shakespeare's plays performed with the more mock classical style seen in Laurence Olivier films, what film critic Kyle Colgren refers to as Shakespeare.
We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us.
So, if the only thing that the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas need to become musical theater is someone to come along and say, hey, you can produce this in a more modern style, then Papp's Pirates should serve as an inspiration for the entire canon. One outlier worth mentioning is the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which, after staging Pirates in 2011 as their first Gilbert and Sullivan in 76 years, followed it up with The Yeoman of the Guard in 2016, directed by Hypocrites alum Jeff Button. It was an immersive staging which placed the audience around the space and updated the aesthetic to an American West setting, with actors playing instruments during the show. This is an outlier, but perhaps it shouldn't be. There is excellent work to be found in all 13 of the operettas. Musical theater companies could look to the already popular Pinafore or Patience, or they could dig deeper with productions of Iolanthe or Princess Ida. I personally have a soft spot for Ruddigore, which is so off the wall in how it applies logic to the idea of being evil, in that it's basically something that you can pass down through a will. If there's a lesson to be learned from this, it's that the transformation of the Pirates of Penzance from an operetta to musical theater is a transition that can be applied to the other Gilbert and Sullivan operettas as well. All it takes is a group of artists passionate enough to make it happen. A director ready to overturn a century-old rulebook on how to stage a classic, a pirate king willing to nearly destroy his body through physical comedy, a leading lady who rejected Bill Elliott's offer to take the music down a step and did all the original keys, and a leading man who is willing to swash till he buckles. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this breakdown on the history of the Pirates of Penzance. This is going to be a new occasional thing that I do sometimes, where I just break down a small moment from theater history in a quick little video. This is not on any sort of a regular schedule, it's just a way that I can keep the discourse going when there's no live theater to review. If you liked this video, please share it to other people who like theater or pirates or both. If you want to watch more, I do have a 6-part series called And Now They Sing about musicals that you don't know based on things that you do. Link in the description. I'll also try to put it on the screen. Maybe I did that. Hopefully the link just appeared. I do have a Ko-fi page now, or Ko-fi page. Ko-fi. I don't know how to pronounce it. But that link is in the description as well if you want to throw me a little bit of donations for this. Thank you so much. If you want to give me suggestions for topics to cover in future videos, please let me know as well. I can't promise that I'll cover everything, although anything that is theater is on the table, whether that's a musical, a play, a performance piece, ballet, anything. I also can't promise that if you donate, your suggestion will be taken more or less seriously. This is not like a tier sort of thing where you get to pick the next video. Just like, donate, also suggestions, maybe do both. Until then, please remember to call your representatives to make sure that art can stay alive throughout the pandemic. Other countries are providing more financial assistance to artists, and we should be asking the same here in the US. The theater scene will not look the same if the only people who are making art after the pandemic are the ones that already had enough financial capital to survive through the pandemic. Art should be made by everyone, and that involves financial assistance for everyone. So please call your representatives and ensure that art will survive. All right, I think that's the end of my soapboxing for now. So thank you again for watching, and goodbye.